Hello, and welcome to episode 8 of the Gospel Culture Podcast. I'm your host, Ben Kreps, and today's episode is part 2 of what I'm calling the missional power of gospel culture. Last episode, we looked at what I mean by gospel culture. It's really just a shorthand way of referring to New Testament Christianity. A gospel culture is a church culture that is marked by the pursuit and presence of humility, fellowship, godliness, serving, generosity, gratefulness, and joy. In other words, a healthy Christian community is not just about being nice people, but it is all about living in the good of the gospel. And as we do, God's grace creates a culture that is a safe place for us to grow and a community of blessing and love. If you haven't listened to the last episode, episode 7, let me encourage you to go back and listen because that episode informs this episode, and I'd love for you to be able to follow along. All right, let's get into part 2 of the missional power of gospel culture right after this. So I'm arguing that gospel culture informs and empowers mission. And that idea is not my own, heaven forbid. That idea is rooted in the scriptures. And one scripture in particular where we see how this works is in Acts chapter 2, verses 42 through 47, where we read, "And they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and the fellowship, to the breaking of bread and the prayers, and awe came upon every soul, and many wonders and signs were being done through the apostles, and all who believed were together and had all things in common. And they were selling their possessions and belongings and distributing the proceeds to all as any had need. And day by day, attending the temple together and breaking bread in their homes, they received their food with glad and generous hearts, praising God and having favor with all the people. And the Lord added to their number day by day those who were being saved." What's the context of these wonderful verses? Well, Acts chapter 2, we find the day of Pentecost has come, Holy Spirit poured out, Peter preaches the gospel, thousands believe the gospel and are saved, and they immediately organize into the community described in the verses I just read, a community with all the aroma, all of the marks of the gospel culture we've been talking about. This is a community of humility and fellowship and godliness and serving. They are grateful, they are glad, they are joyful, they are generous. It's all there. And then tucked away in Acts 2:47 is an important and instructive principle. In the middle of this vibrant gospel culture, we read verse 47, "They had favor with all the people, and the Lord added to their number day by day those who were being saved." So, those who were being saved, how were they saved? Well, they were saved because those people also heard the gospel and believed the gospel. But note, it is in the context of the early church having favor with all the people. Their gospel culture played a vital role in gospel mission. People who didn't know Jesus saw the beauty of their gospel culture And God used that beauty to affect them even as the gospel was proclaimed in fullness and power, and the Lord added to their number. Here's why. A gospel culture, a church that embraces and enjoys the realities of the gospel as growing disciples, not only has the effect of powerful comfort and growth in the lives of the Christians who are part of that church, it has the powerful effect of communicating the beauty and grace of Jesus to a watching world. Jesus talks about this communication in a different way in John chapter 13, verses 34 and 35, where we read Jesus giving a new commandment to his disciples, that we love one another and that all people will know we are his disciples by our love for one another. So we are commanded to love one another, and I would argue love looks like something, and so much of what I'm talking about in gospel culture is what love looks like. And through that love for one another, people are watching. They're coming to know something. They're coming to know something about Jesus through the love of his disciples. Furthermore, in John chapter 17, in what we call Jesus' high priestly prayer, we read in verses 20 through 23, him praying, I ask not for these only, but also for those who will believe in me through their word. That's us, by the way. That they may all be one, just as you, Father, are in me and I in you, that they also may be in us, so that the world may believe that you have sent me. The glory that you have given me, I've given to them, that they may be one, even as we are one, I and them and you and me, that they may become perfectly one, so that the world may know that you sent me and love them even as you loved me. So we see in these texts I've been reading, there is a message. There is an apologetic. There is an argument that God presents to the world through our love and unity. All people will know we are disciples of Jesus by our love, as we reflect his love. Our unity communicates that the Son was sent from the Father. Gospel culture creates an impression on a watching world, favor with others as God works in the hearts of the lost, and the gospel is adorned with the imperfect but actual beauty of his gracious activity in our lives in gospel culture. Ray Ortlund Jr., who I quoted in the last episode from his book, The Gospel, How the Church Portrays the Beauty of Christ, says, the gospel does not hang in midair as an abstraction. By the power of God, the gospel creates something new in the world today. It creates not just a new community, but a new kind of community. Gospel-centered churches are living proof that the good news is true, that Jesus is not a theory, but is real, as he gives back to us our humanness. In its doctrine and culture, words and deeds, such a church makes visible the restored humanity only Christ can give. So, one way to think about our shared mission in the church is that we obey Christ's command to love one another in a culture of grace and blessing and encouragement. And then we open up our arms and invite others into that gospel culture to experience and see and understand what God intends to communicate through gospel culture, even as we earnestly look for ways to communicate verbally the good news of Christ and him crucified and risen from the dead. One example of how this works in my life is I have something at my house past couple of years, a number of times, called a gentleman's day of lawn and leisure. And at G Doll, me and a friend of mine in my community group, we make smoked brisket and perhaps wings in a turkey fryer. So we have a wing bar, and we have yard games at my house, can jam, and things like that. And we invite guys from the church to come and enjoy an afternoon together as men and fellowship and having fun. But we also ask guys to consider inviting anyone in their lives who might not ever want to come to church, but might be interested to come and enjoy a day of yard games and barbecue. And typically, we have had guys who have come who are not Christians and who aren't likely going to come and visit our church or a community group. And through our interactions with these guys, as they've been blessed by friendship, and as we have sought to serve them and give to them a happy afternoon, each time we have had significant gospel conversations. Even as I remember one man saying to me, "By the way, I will never come to your church." And I could not help but think that even though he didn't realize it, he was experiencing the church in my backyard, in that gospel culture, blessing him and creating in him a hearing for the gospel. So God is pleased to use ordinary lives of faithfulness to adorn the gospel in such a way that there is favor, that there is an awareness that Jesus is real as we make visible the reality of who Jesus is. And so, gospel doctrine and gospel culture equals empowered mission. So let me ask you, if you see this and it makes sense to you, let me ask you, how will this function for you in your life? Well, let me suggest one point of application. I promised I would give you one point of application in the last episode, so here it is. And I want to set the bar low. Set the bar quite low. Something doable for each one of us. And so when I share this point of application, I'm not at all seeking to undermine those of us who have strengths and giftings as bold evangelists who go about sharing the gospel wherever they are. I'm not undermining that at all, but I do want to set the bar at a place where ordinary people, where even suffering people, where weak people, where busy people can enter into gospel mission. And it's this. Here's the point of application. Pursue hospitality with gospel intentionality. Pursue hospitality with gospel intentionality. Because hospitality, in effect, draws the threads of gospel culture together. Hospitality, where we open up our homes and lives and we count others as significant and we serve them and we give generously, even as we share and receive food and fellowship with gratefulness. So hospitality expresses gospel culture, and then we invite others in to experience that gospel culture so that we may make visible what Jesus is doing in our lives and create context to share what Jesus has done on the cross. Now, I say it's a low bar, but still it can be quite challenging for those of us who find themselves in the middle of busy lives. And certainly, hospitality can be quite inconvenient. Tim Chester, in his helpful book, A Meal with Jesus, says hospitality will lead to collateral damage. Food will be spilled on your carpet. You'll be left with clearing up. Your pantry may be decimated. but remember that God is welcoming you into his home through the blood of his own Son. The hospitality of God, embodied in the table fellowship of Jesus, is a celebration and sign of his grace and generosity, and we're to imitate that generosity. So let me encourage you to consider pursuing hospitality with gospel intentionality, and in the context of that hospitality, take practical steps to move towards your guests with the gospel. And pastor and author Tim Keller suggests several steps to assist us in thinking about how to do this. So here's 4 steps to moving towards people with the gospel in the context of hospitality. First, let people know you go to church. That's an easy one. Second, let people know you are a Christian and it means something to you. Third, let things bubble up naturally. If we believe that God is sovereign and at work in the world, we will be at peace as we interact with others, and also attentive to what God is doing in their lives. And then fourth, grab hold of opportunities to be bold in sharing the gospel. Listen, I'm telling you right now that almost none of us will drift into a life of robust hospitality. So let me encourage you to sit down and have a talk, have a conversation with your spouse, with your kids if they are old enough, with people in your small group, with those who are around you at church. Have a conversation and pray and think together about how God can use you to reach people far from Jesus by opening up your home and pouring out your life in blessing. In other words, make a plan. Strategize how you can bless your neighbors, your coworkers, your friends, those who don't yet know Jesus. Don Whitney, in his essential book, Spiritual Disciplines for the Christian Life, says, I know a church well where people have hosted home evangelism meetings. They invite neighbors, coworkers, and friends into their homes for the express purpose of hearing a guest talk about Jesus Christ and answering their questions about Christianity and the Bible. The hosts may not feel confident about their ability to articulate the gospel, especially to groups of people, but by serving through hospitality, they provide an opportunity for evangelism by someone whose strength is a verbal presentation of the gospel. By opening up their homes and working with other believers, evangelism takes place that wouldn't have happened otherwise. Listen, God is pleased to move his mission forward through the simple and faithful efforts of his people as we imperfectly but faithfully present to the world the reality of what Jesus does in the hearts of those who trust him, and as we seek to connect them with the good news they must hear if they will be saved. Let me close this podcast by sharing a story to you as a way of communicating care for any who are listening to this podcast who you feel weak and you know your own failures. And you may be thinking to yourself, who am I that God would use me in this way? Keith Jarrett is a world-famous jazz pianist who is perhaps most well-known for his improvised concerts on the piano, where he sits down at a piano in front of an audience and begins to play off the top of his head a new piece. Well, in the mid-1970s, there was a young woman in Cologne, Germany, 17 years old, who was a big-time jazz fan. And she decided she wanted Keith Jarrett to come to Germany and do one of these concerts. So she sets the whole thing up, gets a venue, Keith Jarrett agrees to come, and when he arrives, he walks up onto the stage to take a look at the piano that he's going to play. Now, you should understand, Keith Jarrett is reportedly a perfectionist, so much so that he's been known to hand out cough drops before his performance so that people don't cough during his performance. He plays on a grand piano. He likes everything a particular way. Well, Keith Jarrett took a look at the piano, and that piano is described as being more like half a piano. It was a practice piano. Apparently, the felt was worn off the keys at the upper end of the registry, and it was tinny sounding. The woman who organized this performance describes it as something like the worst little piano in the world. Well, Keith Jarrett takes one look at that piano and decides he will not be playing. So he leaves the theater, he goes out to his car. In a sort of poetic moment, he's waiting in the car to go to the airport. It's raining outside. The young woman comes out to the car in the rain, begging him to come. They have no replacement. The tickets have been sold. And Keith Jarrett finally agrees to perform. So he comes back in, and the time comes for him to play, and he sits down at the piano. The performance will be recorded by his people for posterity so that you can, in effect, know what it's like when Keith Jarrett doesn't get the piano he's supposed to have. But he sits down and begins to play. And that audience immediately is spellbound as Keith Jarrett plays perhaps the most beautiful concert he has ever played. And that recording became the best-selling jazz piano recording of all time. You can check it out online. It's Keith Jarrett's concert in Cologne. So, what's the point of the story? Well, maybe as you think about mission, gospel mission, and what you can do, you are aware that you are weak, that you feel insufficient, that you perhaps feel inadequate. Maybe you think, I'm the worst little piano in the world. But Jesus says, that's exactly the one I want. And as you submit to him, he takes his rightful place and plays the beautiful music of the gospel in and through your life. We get the grace, he gets the glory, and we have the joy of entering into his mission. Never think you are not the kind of person that Jesus can't use to further his cause. You, with all of your weaknesses and failures, are just the kind of person he will use as you step out in faith and trust him. So, gospel doctrine plus gospel culture equals power. This is the missional power of gospel culture. And I hope you will join me in being those who open our arms, invite the lost and the broken in, and make visible imperfectly, but truly, the grace of the Lord Jesus Christ, so that they will come to know and believe the gospel. And in doing so, Christ will build his church and bring glory to his name. Well, thanks for listening to this podcast. I hope this podcast has served you in some way. If you have enjoyed the content on this episode and you haven't already subscribed, please do so wherever you subscribe to podcasts, and then that will keep you in the loop whenever new content drops. Special thanks to Calluna Labs for the music on this podcast. You can check them out on Bandcamp and Spotify. I will be back on this podcast next week for the Tuesday Takeaway. Until then, have a great weekend.